Russia is planning to sue after a credit ratings agency said that it went into selective default. S&P says Russia paid some of its foreign debt using rubles instead of the currency in which the debt was originally sold. Moscow says that it did so because it lost access to a large chunk of its foreign currency reserves due to sanctions. Bitcoin took a hit yesterday, briefly dipping below $40,000 for the first time since mid-March. A year ago today, it was valued at around $60,000. The cryptocurrency is currently sitting at just above $40,000. A new option could help alleviate some pain at the pump. Senior Biden administration officials say that the president will make E15 gasoline available through summer. E15 is a gas with higher percentage of biofuels instead of petroleum. It's about 10 cents cheaper per gallon, though. This announcement comes ahead of a major inflation report being released today, which is expected to show an extreme jump in prices across the energy sector. So we talked about this, expecting this critical report to be released in less than an hour. Across the board, it'll likely show just how expensive gas, groceries, and homes have become. So Greg McBride, chief financial analyst at Bankrate, joins us now to talk a little bit more about this and why we're seeing the inflation that we're seeing. So this is sort of a tough question, I think, to ask right now, which is, what's causing the high inflation rates? Because I don't think it's just one thing. It's many things, both domestic and foreign, if you will. So I'll ask you to sum that up, though, because you're the expert here, and how long we expect this level of inflation to last.
Well, you're right, Anne-Marie, and good morning. Thanks so much for having me. There are a number of different causes. I think the biggest and the first was the fact that after the initial lockdown period of the pandemic, demand rebounded much more quickly than supply could keep up. That produced sort of the initial spike in prices. You complicate that with the supply chain issues that we've seen, which continue to this day. The latest variants and the lockdowns that you're seeing in China, for example, that's just going to create the next ripple of supply chain issues that will work their way across the Pacific. You've had some weather-related events. Mother Nature, for example. Brazil had a difficult winter. That impacted the price of coffee. So those things can come into play when it comes to agricultural commodities. And then, of course, the latest is, of course, the war in Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine, both big exporters of oil and other agricultural commodities, respectively, and that we do expect to see those impacts reflected in the consumer price index that comes out this morning. This is really our first look at those inflation numbers since the outbreak of conflict over there.
So I know, as you pointed out, there's some key areas that people will feel sort of the pinch more than others. Gas, we were talking about how eggs are more expensive for very specific reasons as well. Homes as well. But we also know that people are being paid more. Their increase in pay is not keeping up with inflation. But I'm wondering if the increase in pay is also adding to the inflation.
That's one of the big concerns of the Federal Reserve and other economists, is that what's called a wage price spiral. Those of us that remember the inflation of the early 80s, a lot of that was was spurred on by a wage price spiral, whereby people's expectations for inflation become embedded, higher inflation become embedded, and so they command higher pay. That higher pay translates into higher costs, which then just creates this circle that's not so virtuous. And it's a difficult one to break. If, on the other hand, the inflation does show signs of receding, maybe some of those expectations ease, in which case the strong income growth that we've seen finally over the last year or two, that becomes stickier, and it gives households an ability to sort of catch up to the ever escalating prices. I mean, yes, it's good news is we've seen the type of payroll growth and income growth we haven't seen in decades. Bad news is it still hasn't been enough to keep up with rising prices.
No, it hasn't. But the good news is I sure am learning a lot. Thanks, Greg. I'm Greg McBride.